introductions and supporters. Like every week, we just thank the sponsors who make it possible to run these free master. Let's see, John, you're saying PowerPoint full screen, but not the presentation. Not quite sure what you see there, but I think that should be okay now. Okay, just our sponsors, Corby Speech Analytics. We're very excited. Launched in February, March this year. We now have 32 customers and about 3,500 agents, and it's almost growing 2 customers a week. So really excited about that. Smart Solutions, likewise, a very, very powerful solution and growing exponentially, not only in South Africa, but in the US and Australia as well. IntelliBPO, Jackie Samuel from IntelliBPO, based down in Durban, is with us today. High Touch, High Care Boutique BPO. And of course, our good friends, Axtel headsets, and hopefully the audio quality is a lot better nowadays. I did see a significant improvement when I looked at the recordings last week. So let's get the show on the road. So there we are. So we're jumping around a bit. As I've mentioned previously, during the so-called holiday period, when some people will be going on holiday, I will be rebuilding a lot of the technology masterclass content. So we'll start the year real fresh with a brand new set of presentations around the new omni-channel models. So today, activity-based costing model and assessing, auditing, and benchmarking. Okay, ABC. Now, you might have seen this slide before. In fact, I try and put this into every single one of our presentations and our workshops because it does underpin exactly why we are in business, why we are focusing our attention on our contact centers. Our mission in life, reduce the cost of operations, and in so doing is convert our so-called high cost, high overhead cost centers that we've been known as into a profit center. Secondly, drive up those efficiencies, and we can do that through process design, we can do that through technology, we can do that through training, and any other many ways in which we can achieve that. Thirdly, increase revenues. Depending on how we measure that, it could be revenues from sales, telesales, telecanvassing. It could be from retained customers, retention models. It could be from upsells and cross-sells. Reducing risks, no longer just financial risks, but also business and reputational risks as well. So let me get this up again. Okay, and lastly, increase customer satisfaction. So these are things we need to focus on, and because we know that budgets are tight, restrained, cutbacks all over the place, we need to do a whole lot more with a whole lot less in life. So significant context here is we have to do this well without compromising in any way on the quality. So here's our introduction to activity-based costing. And in this module, it really is a tip of an iceberg. I work very closely with a couple of colleagues in here, notably Hilario Filandero, who's a specialist in contact center costing models. And in a session in the new year, I will invite Hilario in, and he will share some of the more detailed side of the operation. So, examples. So, what can the ABC methodology provide? Let's have a look at this. If we do this correctly, we'll find out and be able to calculate the ROI on any new technology. And in this day and age, where there's a massive trend towards technology refresh, moving from multi-channel into omni-channel, AI, analytics, all of the wonderful stuff that we desperately need in our contact centers, how do we justify it? Well, ABC costing is a basis, is a method that allows us to effectively and very efficiently provide credible ROI modeling, the why and the how, and we can look at how costs can be reduced in our contact center. As you saw on that previous slide, this is one of the key drivers that we need. John's comment here, Rod, I think stop sharing your screen, but PowerPoint and share again doesn't seem to be working. So apologies, we're going to go on hold for a second while we try and sort this out. Stop sharing. Yeah, okay. So now you're looking at my ugly face, and let me get share screen again. Share and make that full screen. And John, you seem to be monitoring this. Are we seeing a full screen now? No, still not full screen. This is very strange. Apologies. Let me try something different now. Stop share again. And, and share screen again. We should be sharing now again. And full screen again. John, if you could just monitor me, please. Perfect. That sounds good. Thank you, John. And away we go. So let's just catch up on this here now then. So we'll be looking at how we can reduce costs in our call centers with the least negative impact on performance and quality. You know, it's very easy just to reduce costs by reducing the number of agents or the qualifications of agents or experience of agents or any number of ways, but it will have serious negative impact on quality. We also need to know which processes represent the highest costs, because this will mean that we can prioritize the implementation of, let's call it, digital migration, and how to move perhaps voice calls into self-service and text-based calls, etc. And let's look at the lower cost alternatives of perhaps channel preferences or automated processes. And then we'll be able to look at the impact of that in financial terms. Very important. And so ABC costing gives the contact center manager the ability to justify those investments in all of those different resources that we have some controls over. It's technologies, facilities, staffing, quality assurance, training, incentives, bonuses, etc. So a lot of this depends on truly understanding to the nearest decimal point the actual costs happening in our operation. So the ability to create an accurate financial picture of the contact center. Yes, I know we spend endless hours every year preparing our budgets for next year, but what do they tend to be, if we're honest? It's this year's budget, allow for inflation and a bit of growth, and so there's the budget for next year. And it's in many, many cases, let's face it, there's a lot of thumb sucking going on. And ABC costing allows us to produce that accurate and credible true picture of our costings. High cost activities, we need to be able to see where they are and how much they're costing us. All the what if scenarios. What if we diverted 20% of our voice calls into self-service through the IVR? What if we invested in AI and bots, perhaps? What would the impact be? What would be the financial impact? What would be the manpower impact? And this, of course, is one of the big ones, is how do we as contact centers justify our existence and move from being that reluctantly funded annual budget into the world of a profit center, where we are seen by the organization to be contributing significantly to the financial well-being of the organization. So enable accurate, credible, and convincing ROI modeling and budget control. And I can assure anybody who is on this webinar today, when you start showing senior and executive management that we in the call center actually understand the language of the boardroom, in other words, money, we're taken far more seriously going forward. So a number of key concepts about this approach we just need to bear in mind is that everything we do in the contact center is a task within a process. So every time we execute a task or a complete string of tasks in a process, then we are consuming one or more, in most cases, multiple resources. So ABC costing is about consumption of resources, labor, systems, facilities, materials, consumables, bandwidth, you name it. And we'll go into details of how we start building these models a little later. So all resources, no matter what it is, have some costs associated with that resource. So ABC is about measuring the consumption of those resources. And that was why last week's session, where we spoke about process engineering and process design, is a key to understanding ABC cost modeling as well. Because if we can understand a process and we can apply the resources to those processes, we're on the home straight to build an accurate ABC model. So our total operational costs are determined by the number of times any task is performed. So it's the sum total of all of the tasks, all of the processes running in and through our operation, our contact center. That is the total operational cost that we need to calculate and to get down to. So an absolute prerequisite to that is, let's make sure that the contact center's operational goals are fully aligned with the organization's strategic and, most importantly, the organization's financial goals. So very often we see budgets in contact centers being prepared without sight of or understanding of where the organization's strategic intent lies and where the organization's financial aspirations are, or their financial realities. So we all get very disappointed when we submit budgets, for example, for new technology, only to be turned down because it's not in the organization's strategic financial budgets. So an absolute prerequisite is to maintain the highest possible level of liaison with the senior executives in the context, in the organization. So first step is define all those activities and processes. Now, as we discussed last week, the importance of processes and process design and process documentation cannot be underestimated. And so the fundamental principle of process modeling carries through into cost modeling. So first and foremost, let's set out and actively identify, design, document, and refine every single one of the processes in our operation. Important within that is to define the tasks that make up an entire process. Let's not forget the granular level that we may need to go to. Remember the exercise last week of making a cup of tea. We burnt out at around about 150 tasks within the process, from the decision to make that tea to drinking that tea. So really important that we start looking at the granular level of the tasks that make up the entire process. Once we have tasks defined, we need to allocate resources needed to carry out each of those tasks. And as you will see as we go on with it, those resources could include and would include the technology, the premises, the infrastructure, the IT support, the management support, the staffing, cost of staffing, direct and indirect staffing. So there's a lot more to it than meets the eye when we start building a cost model. So if we just take an oversimplification, again, please bear with me on this, but merely the cost of labor in a contact center. So if we were to start with how do we define the cost of recruitment, the cost of training, the management and supervisory costs allocated to agents, for example, employee benefits, salaries, incentives, and bonuses, leave, special leave, etc. And if anyone is interested, we have some very sophisticated tools and checklists that assist in arriving at exactly what those sort of costs are. So if we pull all these together, we would end up with a basic cost of labor, be it probably on a monthly basis or an annualized figure. So it just gives us the base cost of that labor. And then, of course, we have that wonderful term called shrinkage. In other words, the unproductive time that an agent is employed, paid, but is not at his or her workstation making and taking calls. And so that factor, and a lot of debate around that, what is shrinkage and how do you define it and what comprises shrinkage? Well, it's your leave, it's your tea breaks, your lunch breaks, it's your schedule adherence, it's training, it's meetings, it's stand-ups, it's all those components that detract from the actual productive hour. Once again, we've got some really interesting models if anybody's interested, and tools on how to build a shrinkage model. What I have found interesting over the years in auditing contact centers, when we and my colleagues ask call center managers, what are your shrinkage factors? And when we start getting, oh, it's 10% or it's 5% or it's 15%, it's a sure sign that there's a lack of understanding within the contact center. Because as you can see, when we start taking the basic cost of labor here, we need to add a realistic figure for shrinkage. Now, if we take the BPO operators who probably run the most efficient operations in the contact center space, because that's bread and butter, and every 1% difference in shrinkage literally means coming off the bottom line. So a really slick, well-run BPO operation, if they're getting into the higher 20s, 25 to 30%, they're doing really, really well. Most corporates would be up in the 30 and 40% space, and in some instances, due to inefficiencies, some, let's say in the public sector, that shrinkage can go 50% and higher. I'd be interested to hear any feedback. John Polton, you're sitting on the outside there, and I really would appreciate your comment on that one. If you feel like coming in live on this webinar, just put your hand up and let's have a live discussion around that. John, are you there? I'm going to make you allowed to talk. John, you can unmute and join us if you wish.
You're putting me on the spot, Joe, right?
I'm putting you on the spot there, John. Just by way of introductions to everybody else on the team, John and I go back many years, and he's got a lot of deep experience in operational side of contact centers, and particularly that wonderful world of KPI. Okay, John, you've got a few moments. Would you share with us your views on shrinkage in contact centers? I would appreciate it.
Yeah, so I think, one of the things I do is measure agent performance in contact centers. I've built some models that run live and show what your agents do all day, every day. And shrinkage is quite a big issue. And I think a lot of people don't realize it until they've got the stats in front of them, because it's not just your lunch breaks and tea breaks and things like that. It's if you don't have some kind of strict schedule adherence where you're making sure that the guys are not taking more than half an hour for lunch and half an hour for tea and 10 minutes for toilet and smoke breaks. And it's not just that, it's also when they go for coaching or training or meetings or anything like that. Agents have a knack of knowing their way around what they are being measured on and what they aren't being measured on. So they'll opt to go coaching, they'll go for a coaching session, which might take 15 or 20 minutes, but then they'll go for a smoke, go for coffee, and then they go back to their desk. So legitimately on the system, you can see that the agent's had a coaching break, and he's had a training break, and he's had his lunch break and tea break. But was it more than he should have done? And if you're not measuring that, you'll be horrified the more agents you've got. I mean, in a 100-seat call center, I've seen cases where that adds up to hundreds of hours a day and thousands of hours a month. And if you just, and we all know what the usual call center managers' gripe is about not being able to meet service levels. Most of the call center managers I speak to will say they need more staff. And in actual fact, if you deal with shrinkage, you actually don't need more staff. You've actually got more than enough staff sitting right in front of you. So if you manage that and you can bring that shrinkage down, sometimes in cases right down to like 5%, if you've got the tools to manage it, you can bring it down to 0. And then any shrinkage that is there, the agents actually get penalized for. So not only is it not costing you anything, you're recovering costs on the shrinkage from their incentives and bonuses. So it can make a huge difference. You can have 100 seats and not be making your service levels, or just making your service levels. And by monitoring shrinkage, you'll suddenly find that your service levels are sitting in the 90s. And you've actually managed to cut a couple of heads. And if you multiply that out over a year, that can add up to millions of rands bottom line that you could be better spending on incentives or benefits, or upgrading technology, or redefining your business processes and optimizing them to give better service, or building a self-help platform, or the list is endless.
Thanks for that, John. And I think we're going to invite John back in the new year. We'll run a special session around KPIs and how we can interpret them correctly and use the information from the stats and the data that we've got is to more effectively manage our operations. Thanks for that, John. Appreciate that.
Pleasure.
Put you back on mute now. There you go. Thanks for that. Okay, so there we have some really interesting stuff on shrinkage. But as John said, only by really understanding the data and working with it and refining your processes and your disciplines, will you systematically be able to reduce that shrinkage. So just for the purposes of this model, we're going to take our basic cost of labor and add whatever that shrinkage factor is. And as a rule of thumb, I would have a starting point of about 30%. So armed with that information, we're able to calculate the true cost of our labor per unit hour, and therefore as a consequence, obviously per minute or even down to per second. And so where we have a process now within our contact center, let's take a silly example of a directory inquiries type contact center. It's answering that call. It is perhaps going through a gateway of different tasks around that. Is it just a number required? Is it a number plus a click through to that number? Whatever that process is, each of these tasks, whether it is in seconds or minutes, we actually now able to apply to this task a unit of currency. It costs so much. I did mention last week various modeling tools like Visio or Visagi. In the properties of those tasks, you are able to allocate into each of these multiple cost elements. So we would have the cost of labor, we would have infrastructural costs, we would have IT costs, telecommunication costs, etc. But in this case, we are simply looking at labor. So there's our time cost to complete a task. And therefore, if we simply add that all up, or using a tool like Visagi or Visio, it will do the work for us. It will give us a time cost for the entire process. So this, as I mentioned, is one dimension. This is just the cost of labor. And I think a lot of contact center managers will be startled, frightened, shocked beyond words to see what the actual cost of handling a typical interaction in the contact center. So I would typically start by defining the different types of interactions, define the processes around each of those interactions, define the tasks that make up those processes, and then start applying cost modeling to it. Here's a headline on cost of infrastructure, and these are just a few of the many line items that make up the cost of infrastructure. Just out of interest, when you meet my colleague Hilario in the new year, when I ask him to run a session, he will share with you his cost models that he's built over the years. Some of those models run to 300 and 400 line items of individual costs that do need to be taken into account. So, you know, simply lease and rental on every square meter of space that our contact center occupies has a cost associated with it, as does the rates and taxes, maintenance, utilities, insurance, and probably many more cost items against that. Furniture and fittings, which need replacing every few years. And of course, our cost of technology is not just the hardware and the software and the licensings, but it's the support on that technology and the maintenance on that technology. And so every single interaction in and out of our contact center carries with it a component of these costs. So a simple way to approach it is to try and get down to a basic cost per workstation hour. You can start with a ballpark figure and then start working it down as one becomes more granular and gets to the real grips of the matter of how much is our cost per workstation hour, per workstation minute. We would then apply it back to the tasks within that process. So we would then have labor and infrastructural costs. What I haven't got here on this one, the third component would be management, cost of management. And so here we have a contact center agent, but we have perhaps 8 agents to 1 supervisor or team leader, and therefore we need to appropriate the costs of that supervisor or team leader across those agents to get a true cost per agent hour. Above the call center supervisor, we might have a manager, we might have QA personnel, we might have workforce managers, etc. So a component cost of each of those management resources, we can start filtering it down and applying and appropriating some of that cost to the actual operational workstation. So as I said, this is 101, basic introduction to the methodology. We'll drill down into it later. We then need, of course, to define the frequency that each of those tasks is carried out or performed in the contact center. And there'll be a lot of variables and drivers from seasonality to special events to marketing and promotions and many other variables which we need to take into account. Based on that, we can then calculate the task volumes and the process volumes. How many of these tasks do we carry out? How many of these processes do we carry out? And remembering we now have costs associated with each one of those tasks. And that allows us then to ascertain the accurate cost of each of those resources in our contact center. And I think there are a lot of contact center managers that I've seen being shocked beyond words when they start seeing the real true cost of operations. You know, one of the questions I often ask in my live masterclasses, where I might have 30 or 40 call center managers, I said, give me your cost per minute to run a call, a typical voice call through your call center. And it's frightening to understand how few contact center managers actually know what that figure is. And the guesses range from 1 rand a minute to 25 rand a minute. It's all over the place. What we're trying to establish with ABC costing is I know and I understand my costs down to the last cent. Once again, I stress how different the boardroom will start seeing managers who work with this type of figures. Once we have these numbers, we can start building these baseline budgets for the entire contact center. And this is the real budget, not the thumb suck based on last year's budget and escalated. And obviously, because we're dealing in data here, it's all about dashboards and reports. And this is where we would bring somebody like our colleague here, John Polton, in to start building those dashboards and reports for us. And this is, once again, a very oversimplified model. And if we take in this hypothesis being a mobile phone company, you can see the types of activities that might go through a mobile contact center, from swim, swap, balance inquiries, set up voicemails, etc., etc. So what have we done here? We've identified the core processes behind each of these as a set of tasks, and we can see the number of interactions that we are getting across here, and we can allocate, let's call these the costs per process on a monthly basis or an annualized basis. So all of a sudden we have a snapshot that says, oh, we're spending a huge amount of money on setup handsets, and we're spending a lot of money on activation, deactivation, and a fair amount on setup email and transfer airtime. Now, aren't these the ones that we should be looking at to automate or put in self-help or anything to divert it from a typical voice call, which is our most expensive way to process an inquiry? So all of a sudden, we are able to see very clearly where we need to focus our attention. So rational prioritization, cost reduction, or process improvement, because many of these we may be able to reduce the cost simply by changing the internal processes and re-engineering those. So once we start working with real numbers here, we can start putting these type of figures together. We can say, there's my baseline cost if I do absolutely nothing in my call center. Let's say we have an annual budget of 8 million. Over the next few years, it's going to rise to 10 million if we simply do absolutely nothing. On the other hand, if we re-engineer processes, we might be able to reduce it significantly, even in the short term, and to cap it in this hypothetical example at about 8.5 million. Once again, showing the savings in rand, dollar, or whatever currency you want, and percentages. And in this hypothesis, it's based perhaps on 2 contact centers, 2 different sites, and looking at the models, we're able to say, well, what if we consolidated our operations into a single site? Well, in which case we're going to have significant overhead savings, so we're able to reduce it there. We're going to be able to cap those costs over a 3-year period and manifest a 27.3% cost saving to the organization and 7 million rand into the shareholders' bottom lines, which makes the boardroom very, very happy. Now, there are very few contact centers that have actually been able to present these type of models into the boardroom when they are requesting increased budgets or budgets for technology, staffing, whatever it is. But armed with real credible information backed up by a lot of granular data, this makes a very compelling case in the boardroom. So financial benefits of both the action and the consequences of inaction, which is really important. And the inaction is this frightening, escalating, ever increasing cost to the operation. So if we do absolutely nothing, it's going to cost us 10 million. But if we work with our systems, reduce our costs through astute interventions, we're going to certainly save a lot of money for the organization. So more benefits of the methodology itself. It takes us to a space where we're able to look at the absolute exact cost savings and the opportunities within the contact centers. It shows the boardroom that we are understanding and we are aligned with the organization's business goals and objectives, and particularly the financial realities in there. Basis for credible evaluation, and there's your cost benefit. Do we invest in speech analytics? What's the ROI going to be? Well, we're going to be able to QA 100% of our calls. We may be able to reduce the number of QAs. As the case in point, in Durban, a particular contact center had 200 assessors in their QA department. by implementing speech analytics, we were able to reduce it to 80. So there's again a very credible way of projecting a cost benefit. We also then puts us in a place where we can start looking at building models that show the contact center's contribution in financial terms or customer satisfaction terms to the entire organization. And many, many, many what ifs. What if we reduced headcount? What if we reduced shrinkage? What if we applied more discipline and reduced attrition rates or schedule adherence problems, etc. So it's all there. And it's no longer thumb sucks and answers like, how much will we save? And the answer is, I think it might be quite a lot. We need to be able to say, how much will you save? You need to put it into exact terms. So there it is, providing the boardroom with true business intelligence in terms of the organization's frame of reference, which is about financials, it's about market share, it's about stock price, let's face it, it's about shareholders and directors' bonuses. It's all about the money. It's not about the terms that we use and bandy around and AHTs and KPIs and all sorts of acronyms which the boardroom doesn't understand, not in the least. So with these models, we're certainly able to get into that boardroom and give them true business intelligence. And so using this methodology, we are actually able to show the executives that a contact center is, I call it, this key strategic resource. And there's the end goal. There's that board of directors. And this looks like I don't know, I think it must be a New Zealand board of directors. It's certainly not a South African board of directors. But the message is there. We want them to say our contact center is our most important strategic resource. And we get there by implementing this ABC cost modeling. So just some key points in here. We need to ensure the contact center is 100% supportive to the organization's strategic and tactical goals, and not the other way around where there's a disconnect between the boardroom and the operation. We need to establish those cost and value-based KPIs for the call center. We need to monitor those KPIs, as we saw in one of the previous sessions, past, present, and goal and action-orientated future. As you can see, once we have started applying monetary terminology to our KPIs, it's a total game changer. We need to ensure all of those processes impeccably designed and well documented, and we need to build those activity-based costing processes and our reporting models around those. And once we have that, we're able to present those credible reports on operational and consequential costs. And for example, as I said, the cost of action and the cost of inaction, very important. This is taking us closer and closer and closer to being able to clearly show the contribution and the value that the contact center brings to the organization, that move away from cost center to value center and upwards and onwards into profit center. So build those senior management performance dashboards clearly demonstrating contribution, value, and revenue. Show me the money. That's what the boardroom wants to see. So, are there any questions to come through on the chat line or on the Q&A line? I don't see anything in the Q&A. We'll just have to take a brief pause here now. Anything coming through? No messages. Anybody want to come in, put up their hand, and I will make you live? Nobody. Okay. Just check. Right, so everybody ready for the second part? And I see we're coming up for, I think we'll probably do it in about 25 minutes. So it'll go slightly over the 1 hour. But the next session is actually, in my opinion, really, really important. So Come with me on a little journey down assessing, auditing, and benchmarking of your contact center. And this is something for the last 10 or 15 years I've been spending a huge amount of time doing here in South Africa, across a lot of countries in Africa, and of course the Middle East, particularly Dubai. So let's just have a quick look at this. We start with a good old cliche: you can only manage it if you can measure it. So as we spoke about in the financial modeling, we can only really manage our contact center if we can measure it in financial terms, for example. And this is right into John Polton's space. He's the expert in KPIs. So John, I'm going to ask you to pop in on this a little later as well. So let's talk about benchmarking. Now, benchmarking tells us, in terms of our operation, where are we now? What stage of development are we in? Where are we going? It forces us to set those goals and targets and point us in the right direction. Why are we in the space that we are in? Are we a toxic contact center? Are we experiencing huge problems with customer satisfaction dropping and attrition going through the roof? It's really to understand all of those. And so effective service delivery, no matter what operation we're doing, is governed by the metrics. It's the numbers that tell us just about everything we need. So we need to take a look at our baselining and benchmarks. And in this session, we'll look at why contact centers should have those baselines and benchmarks. What is it we should be looking at to baseline and benchmark? How to define them for a brand new contact center, because there's many a time, and it's very difficult in some cases, where organization reaches a decision that it needs a contact center and hasn't a clue about budgeting, resourcing. And so important that we get those benchmarks into place, both in existing and in new contact centers. I'm going to show you a number of different methodologies and some examples, and some reports and examples about the benefits and how one can interpret those reports. And of course, how those benchmarking models and tools are used to drive that continuous improvement. So that's what we'll cover over very, very quickly. So why should we do this exercise? Well, it certainly provides the basis for aligning our contact center with those business strategies that I spoke about earlier. As unless we know what the boardroom wants, how can we drive our contact center operation to achieve that? So the first point here is that it helps us align those two strategies. Monitors effectiveness of our service delivery processes. When we start looking at the real inner workings of how we do things in the contact center, it will very often drive us back to the need to re-engineer many of those processes. The auditing, assessing, baselining, and benchmarking will drive us towards a true understanding of where we can focus on cost reductions and or revenue or opportunity generation in there. It's a classic SWOT analysis: our strengths and our weaknesses, our opportunities and our threats, but specifically our weaknesses and our strengths. We're going to be measuring against what generally now become recognized internationally and nationally as best practice operations. 15, 20 years ago, we had a fragmented industry spread across the world with very little interaction. Today, contact centers throughout the world are pretty much aligned towards these best practices. We have greater communication between regions and individual operations, so better understanding of what is best practice. And it's a moving target, because as things change, COVID, for example, has changed a lot of things in our world. And best practice of 2 years ago is no longer best practice. A year ago, we didn't have best practice for home workers or work from home. We need to benchmark against our competitors. It's all well and good to think that we run a really classy operation, but if our competitors are eating our breakfast, we'd better do something about it. This methodology gives us this disciplined and structured approach. It's not merely calling a consultant in who strolls around the contact center and writes up a report. It's the individual perspective of the operation. What we need is a disciplined, structured approach that no matter who carries out that assessment or audit, the results and findings will pretty much be the same. And if we're in the BPO space, if we've got an audited contact center and we are certified against international best practice and particular standards, it gives us a significant competitive advantage when bidding for business. It also allows us to future-proof our contact centers. The various contact centers that I've done benchmarking and auditing over the years, when COVID came along, the majority of them were pretty well prepared to move very quickly and be agile and to deploy, for example, work from home. They've also moved more rapidly into the omni-channel world than those contact centers that don't regularly baseline and benchmark their operations. So why should we assess? Well, it's knowledge-based decisions are the only ones that count, not just the gut feeling and intuitive perspectives. So we need to know, why is it performing the way it is? And that's good or bad. We need to understand why or what is driving that. Is it we've got great processes? Is it that we have fantastic technology? Is it that we have great skills in management and supervisors? And in many cases, it's who's responsible for the levels of performance, good or bad. Is it the individual? Is it the team? There's something that we need to know there. We need to prioritize because there may be some serious core issues which are driving performance in one or other directions. And then, of course, we need to understand what do we need to do to implement these improvements. Compliance, and as we've seen in previous sessions, we've got a whole lot of standards out there, SABS standards, PCI standards, FSB, ISO standards, etc. And of course, compliant in terms of perhaps requirements in terms of an outsourcing contract. We need to be able to look at real and potential risks to the business, and particularly those risks that are seated in the contact center. And the exciting side is it highlights where we've got opportunities. Those opportunities could be cost reduction. Those opportunities could be revenue generation. Those opportunities could be line extensions into internal services. In other words, contact center takeover, what may have previously been outsourced collections or telemarketing or services, whatever it is. And back to how do we reduce cost and increase profit, as every boardroom wants to know. And then to do all these wonderful things, what resources will be required? How much we need to invest? What technologies do we need? What changes do we need to make to our organizational structure, etc.? And what will be the cost of those? So various organizations, and ICA, which is the Independent Contact Center Consultants Association, best practice requires an audit or an assessment every 12 months. That takes us into pretty close to being a world-class operation. Just interesting to see the difference between an assessment and an audit. An assessment is a process of collecting and analyzing information, presenting recommendations for decision-making, and an appraisal or an evaluation of something going on. That's an assessment. Whereas an audit is a degree to which evidence and results of activities in compliance with standard processes. So this is evidence-based. Show me the documents, show me the processes, show me the KPIs, show me the data, and let me truly understand it. And how does it measure up to defined standards? Checking procedures to ascertain if the plan, process, arrangements meets stated objectives. So very different approach. As independent consultants, when we go into a site, we tend to use the term assessment, because as soon as you say audit, people run for cover and start producing hogwash information just to cover the collective you know what. So observation versus evidence and proof. So I'll flick through this again because you have seen this before, but auditing and assessing and benchmarking allows us to quantify all of these components. So let's take it through there. What does it take to be a world-class contact center? And this is repeating some of the stuff from our opening session five sessions ago. But to be certified as a world-class contact center, we need to make sure that the operation is mature in its integration, processes and systems and technologies, etc., and it is matured in terms of strategic alignment. In other words, it's doing everything that the organization wants, needs, and expects of it. So over the years, and this goes way back to 2006, when my colleagues and I first developed this model, when we had a company called, some might remember, C3 Africa. We defined it as the early stages of a contact center as being foundational. It moves into fundamental. We've got some of the basics in place. We're in the stages of developing. We are well matured. Things are kind of running well, and we know where we're going, and we're delivering high-class customer services, and the organization and the boardroom's pretty pleased with us. And then if we have world-class, which is really going way beyond. And in fact, in my opinion, the sweet spot is just there between mature and world-class. World-class tends in many cases to be an overkill, but we'll discuss that in great detail in another session. And so the auditing, assessing, and benchmarking process is ascertaining where is your call center on this horizon, on this diagonal. Where are you? And there's some frightening realities that come out of a benchmarking. And this is a model. This was, in fact, way back, it was about 2006, 2007, at a time when my colleagues and I were developing this methodology. And this was a real live contact center. And the background to that, we were called in to do an assessment and to provide a certificate because the CEO believed that they were a world-class contact center and he needed an audit to prove it to his client. Well, sadly, we completed the audit, and this is where we found them. And I'll expand on that story a little later. Because what happened after the second audit, and you see it in 2008, was a pretty basic and fundamental call center. I'll show you the scoring methodology shortly. However, in a fairly quick turnaround, you can see they managed to turn it into a developing, and ironically, within a year, we're literally on the cusp of becoming a world-class contact center. And the result was achieved through process reengineering and disciplines. No new technology, no new headcount. It was simply a matter of taking the organization and laying bare its faults through an audit process and then systematically fixing each one of those line items. And as I said, this was quite a rewarding case to work with because in the end, that did end up as a pretty close to a world-class contact center. Still in operation, and one day I'll actually tell you who it is. So one of the methodologies is a cloud-based, and there's several of these available, but I'm going to show you the one that I'm familiar with. I've used it from last decade. It's called Snapshotz. And basically it breaks down a contact center into 8 primary sections and 29 subsections, and it asks, that's numbers gone up. It's closer to about 600 questions. Basically, it's asking questions coming from a certified assessor. We'll be asking the management team of a contact center these questions, and how these questions are answered, and I'll show you an example of it, actually results in a true understanding of the business. Over 700 variables in there. And in the background, because it is a cloud-based system, you're assessing your contact center against around about 3,000 other call centers, and also a raft or a table of recognized best practice KPIs and figures. So these are the areas that are assessed. Corporate objectives, as you can see, this is really understanding the corporate environment. CRM component, you can see the depth that we probe when we look at it. Health and safety and well-being, 5-10 years ago, health and safety in South Africa in particular was not really a big concern. We just got on and just did the job. However, in the last few years, and particularly now with COVID, this has become a massive issue. So this particular tool was built for a global market, particularly UK, Australia, and New Zealand, and therefore a lot of emphasis on health and safety. Physical environment, recruitment, training, processes, operational metrics, and technologies. So as you can see, it's an extensive exercise, and it really probes deep into how the operation works. And this is just a very quick example of how it works. So in this example, a question is going to envisage the management team sitting around a boardroom table, and the facilitator, in this case, I'll do the job, asks the question, is there a health and safety policy in place? And it's a yes, no, or sometimes it's not applicable, obviously. We then ask the team, how good is it? Is it excellent, good, basic, poor, very poor? And it's an intuitive response, and sometimes it takes a bit of alignment around the table to get everybody saying, okay, it's in this hypothetical example, we can say our health and safety policy is poor. And why is it poor? And here's just an example. So the health and policy has been in place, is 5 years out of date, has not been aligned with new legislation or corporate policy changes. So it's not a long essay, it's just what the people around the table say. So it's a quick comment. We then prioritize it. Generally speaking, red means it needs to be fixed within 3 months, and amber is within 6 months, and we do green in there as well. That is, well, everything is pretty good. We don't actually have to do anything. We then set a deadline, and we set a very brief task. Policy documentation to be checked for compliance and relevance and aligned. Once again, not a long essay. These questions, when we're doing these assessments, we allow pretty much 5 minutes per question. Otherwise, it turns into a workshop. If it was going to end up in a great disagreement, then the task, in fact, would be set up a workshop to resolve this issue. So here we're defining the task. In this case, we're saying what Jones is going to do, there's his email address. And literally, as we click to the next question, it fires off this email and into a project management tool that now says there's a particular task to be done. In the background, against the best practice guidelines, it is scoring this particular question. As you can see, the task is sent, and we also output it into CSV. What's coming out of that, if you can imagine, we've been through 600 or 700 of these questions, and we now have the consensus view of the management team, and literally on completion of the questions, it spits out a report, key focus areas. Now, in this one, the index score that we're scoring against the benchmark, which is the aggregate of all the other users worldwide, about 3,000 other users, you can see we've got massive gaps here in these particular areas. On the other hand, we're not doing too badly. Green means we actually don't have to do anything about it. We're within the parameters of it. And yellow says, you've got to do a little bit of work to increase these figures to get them up closer to the global benchmark. Here's a summary report or an executive report showing how the different areas of our contact center performed against the global benchmarks and standards. And then you can see them by each sector. So down here, contact quality management, we're scoring 81 against 83. We actually don't have to do anything there. Whereas voice messages, automatic responses, etc., needs a lot of work. So it's highlighting where we need to focus our attention. It's also possible, and I've done this several times, where we have multiple sites. We run the same questions against, in this case, multiple sites, and we can see the different scores on the different sites. Sometimes they're aligned, sometimes they're not aligned. Other times we'll use this tool to say this was the 2018 assessment, the next one might be the 2019 assessment, and we can see how they develop in parallel. So the weighted scores in the background, as you can see there, come from a whole lot of sources, and there's a panel of, I think it's up to about 30 consultants worldwide who we review these standards and benchmark scores pretty much twice a year and adjust them where appropriate. So there you can see how we can score a contact center against global best practice standards on it. So that was just the one methodology I wanted to share with you. This is another one. It's a very straightforward, it's not even a technology assisted methodology. This is a piece of paper, it's printed out, and you stick pins in it. That's how old fashioned it is. And what we're looking at in these models, we have a 1 to 10 and a 10 to 1 in terms of customer service impact. In other words, if it's low impact on customers, we'll score it down here. However, if it has a high impact on customer service, it'll be up this side. Here we are looking at measuring ourselves, are we worse than, same as, or better than our competitors, for example, or our own targets. There's our competitors and performance assessed against agreed benchmarks. If it's up here, in other words, we are so far better than anything we ever dreamed of, and it's of low importance to customers, we are then excessive. We're spending too much money, time, and effort with very little return. On the other hand, down here, we are far worse than our competitors, for example, and it is of high impact to customers. Then it's in the critical zone, requiring attention. And up here is anything in this space is where we want to be. So picture putting your KPIs onto little flags with pins and sticking them into this board once a week with your management team. So if, for example, the stats come in and we're saying 99% of our calls are being answered in under 20 seconds, stick a pin in the board and say, this is ridiculous. We just overstaffed. So somebody do something about it. If our abandoned calls are in at, say, 5% or 4%, which is the best practice guideline, it's in our desirable performance zone. What do we have to do? Nothing. Just leave it be. We're right on the money there. If we start seeing our average talk time increasing from 300 seconds to 380 seconds and creeping up to 400 seconds, something is wrong. And so our average talk time falls into our requires attention zone. And we can then look at it very clearly, and it's a visual reminder that we need to review that. Down here, our first contact or first call resolution is pathetic. We're down in the 30-40% range. We're far worse than our own benchmarks and our own targets, and we're far worse than our competitors, and it is of high impact to customers. So it requires urgent attention in the critical zone. So I have a number of clients that use these models. One in particular, on the wall behind his desk at his office is a call center. He runs about 250 seats. He has one of these for each of his KPIs. So you can see that flag moving as he's implementing those changes and developments. So very easy to implement. Now, I've written a little ebook which you're most welcome to have. It's all of the methodologies and processes of how to set up your self-service or self-help auditing process. All the tools are in there. If you want the Excel spreadsheets, you just email me and I'll send those along to you as well. So feel free to do that. So there was just a very brief introduction into baselining and benchmarking. I said a lot more information available online, and I'm very happy to send any information along. So that thus ends the session 9. I see we're about 15 minutes over, but please feel free to email me or just reach out and I'll be able to assist you with any other materials or examples, point you in the right direction to various websites, etc. And we close with thanks once again to our sponsors, Corby, Smarts, IntelliBPO, and I will change the logo, Jackie, because I know it has changed, and our friends at Axel Headsets. So once again, thank you very much for joining. This is the last session for 2020. We'll have a whole lot of really new material, which will be ready by mid-January. I have everybody's email addresses and I'll forward details of the new sessions in 2020. So any comments coming in, feel free to put in the chat line there. I hope everybody's enjoyed these last few sessions. I think some of our delegates here need some sort of certificate for perseverance. They've attended all of them. So no names, no factual, but thank you very much for staying with me on this, and I wish you all happy holidays and be a safe and happy festive season, and we'll see everybody in the new year. Thank you very much indeed.